Lovely to meet you, Henrietta. Tell us a bit more about who you are and why you're here today.
Well, I have a background in financial services, and also I have a background which is very strongly looking at customers and also behaviour. Funnily enough, I've been talking about that for a while now, and behaviour is very core to ESG, which is something I've been doing for over 20 years. I've been involved in pulling a paper together about how you as an organisation need to think about the S of ESG and the well-being of your people being the core foundation of that. And that's why you invited me along to talk to you today. As I'm sure many people listening to this will know, it's Mental Health Awareness Day in October. And I'm really excited to be here to talk to you a little bit more about the work we've done.
Thank you. So tell me, this is on behalf of the MindForward Alliance. Tell us a little bit more about who they are.
Yes, of course. So MindForward Alliance started life as City Mental Health about just after the financial crash. It was set up and organised by a number of business folk and a fantastic social entrepreneur called Poppy Jamin. It was focused at the time, as the name might describe, City Mental Health Alliance, on city firms, predominantly, obviously in London. And it has been operating with businesses to help them support their own people with mental well-being. And that it's a membership organisation, and we have set it up now as a global charity because all of our members, most of them are large companies, have wanted to make those facilities and knowledge available more broadly across the whole of their network, many of which are global operators. And so we've been driven by those members, and we've now set up MindForward Alliance as a charity, global charity, to do that, and we are setting up chapters all over the world driven by our members. So last week, for example, we kicked off the US, which was exciting. We're already in Hong Kong, Singapore, India. We're now getting set up as well, Australia, New Zealand, Portugal, which is interesting but great. And we're looking, and the nice thing about Portugal is when we start to develop the work there, we should be able to then access Spain, Latin America, and start to develop it out. And Poppy's ambition is to be in at least 70 or 80 different markets globally. So about half of the business environment. And again, one of our global members, for example, wants to help us set up in Africa. So we're really excited about it. But that's a little bit about the charity that we're driving.
Lovely. So the CISI obviously got members in most of those countries, and if members were interested in the work that the MindForward Alliance is doing, and how are you open for them to get involved and to help shape the agenda?
Absolutely, and I think it's really important to think about it locally as well as globally. I mean, we are a global organisation, which is great, and there are a lot of things we can do at a global level to support businesses. We're a B2B organisation, but actually. Mental health is also quite a local issue because it's heavily driven by the local culture and also actually what type of organisation you're in and the stage of that organisation in its sort of thinking and development of culture and those kinds of things. So actually the local best practice is incredibly important because not only do the different issues vary, and I'll give you an example, India, for example, stigma is really important in India. It's almost kind of top of the list. It's really, really difficult to get people to openly talk about mental health in the workplace, to admit they may not be feeling great or that they might need some help. And actually breaking that stigma in India is going to be a really important component part of being successful. Whereas in other markets, people are very happy to talk about the US, for example. But what they're looking for there is, how do I maintain the wellness, if you like, or the well-being of my people? How do I, build resilience into my company? And what are some of the things that work? What are some of the things that don't work? Where are the good ideas? How can I share those and get better at this stuff? So it entirely depends on which market you're in. So actually the localness is as important as the sort of the top-down capability as well. And we definitely recognise that and realise that you need a local chair, a local programme director, and to your point, the businesses that are members of your organisation, those people operating in those local markets will be really fundamental to getting the right programme together for those markets because it'll vary.
No, very much so, which brings us nicely to the report that you've written for the MindForward Alliance. Tell me what your role is in that and where the report came from.
Really interesting. So I was working in another membership organisation, and when I left last summer, and I've always been involved in wellbeing and ESG more broadly. I was thinking about what I wanted to do next, and I've known Poppy for a long time. She used to do a lot of work for us on mental well-being and other aspects of the agenda that I was running. And she rang me up and she said, oh, well, in the meantime, can you come and help me, please? And I went, yeah, go on then. All right. So I've been working as an advisor for her, and essentially what I've been doing is helping her set up the global charity, helping her think about how we set up the local chapters, helping her bring businesses into the community from a global perspective, thinking about the agenda. And one of the things that we felt was really important, and I felt was really important, was that I think there were three things. One was that the pandemic really shone a light on the well-being of one's staff, colleagues, whatever. And I know, because I was in a role at the time where, I don't know, 80-85% of my time, I should think, was making sure my people were okay. And it became very clear very quickly to leaders that if their people were stressed or weren't well or were frightened, which many of them were, then the performance of their work deteriorated quite significantly. And it was quite interesting because when you have a look at that, people were, for the first, in the old days, before the pandemic, or the old days, it wasn't that long ago, people assumed that, your kind of well-being was something that you sort of left at the office door or the factory door or the shop door or whatever. But actually, because that then became your front door, you had a collision of your home life and your work life for many. I mean, I know a lot of people actually went to work, but I mean, a lot of people didn't. They were at home. And I think that, business leaders for the first time really recognised and saw that actually you couldn't differentiate between the two. They were actually aligned. And because it was a very stressful, frightening environment for a lot of people to operate in, it was very clear that they were struggling as well. And new ways of working, people not well, having to homeschool, all of those kinds of things. So I think that was one of the key issues, that the pandemic really focused leaders' minds on how their people were, and therefore how they could perform or not in that environment. The second thing I really want to talk about is that my perspective, particularly post-COP actually, I mean, COP was great, don't get me wrong, in Glasgow. Post-COP was that S was a bit of a corporate orphan. A lot of people were doing stuff on E, and a lot of people were doing stuff on G.
So tell me, ESG, what does that stand for?
Environmental, social, and governance. So post-COP, a lot of people had made commitments around environmental and biodiversity and all of those sorts of things. Governance has always been a really strong thing, particularly in our sector, financial services, but also across listed businesses and those sorts of things. But S was a bit of a corporate orphan in terms of focus. And I think the third piece was that a lot of people actually didn't know what S was. Most people are doing something in S, but there was no sort of clarification around what are the fundamental building blocks of S. How do you do them? How do you measure them? And why should we be doing them? That wasn't to say people weren't doing good work in S, they were. And some people were looking at it as a risk, some people were looking at it as a reputational thing, some people were looking at it as we should do it because it just kind of feels like it's the good thing to do. But a lot of people weren't actually kind of going, is this fundamental to our business? And so our members actually within MindForward Alliance were actually saying, can you help us pick through this? And when you do, can you tell us where mental well-being sits within that kind of framework? Because we kind of know it's important, but we're not quite sure and we need some help. So that's when I started to have conversations with chairs, with Oxford University, who are doing some fantastic work actually in their well-being area, which we'll talk about a little bit in a moment, and a range of different folk who have been involved in this, both from a sort of the medical end of the spectrum right the way through to the sort of professional businesses and people who understand business culture and strategy and all of those kinds of things, and started to sort of formulate a hypothesis of where it should sit, what it should include, and why it's important. I mean, I knew it was important, and then looking at who's got the data to support that and all of those sorts of things. So that's really where it crystallised for us, and we decided we needed to write a proper positioning paper on it.
So you're suggesting actually that wellbeing should be a strategic business priority.
Mm-hmm.
Just expand on that a little.
It is really clear from the data that is being collected globally that if your people aren't well, your organisation doesn't thrive. And there's a very good correlation between business performance and resilience and whether or not people enjoy working for you and do their best work and feel comfortable working for you. And that is well-being. And what we looked at, Oxford University have been doing some fantastic work. So they've got a professor of wellbeing called Jan Emmanuel Deneve, and he and his team have done some fantastic correlation analysis and with business data globally, looking at the levers within an organisation that people's sort of thinking within organisations that actually roll up into their overall feeling of well-being. It's also interesting to note that 60% of people's feelings of well-being and or stress and those kinds of things come from business and their work environment, not from home. I suppose it's not surprising to spend so much time at work, but a lot of people forget that. So it's actually really important to get it right because it does have a big impact on their overall, levels of stress and feelings of well-being. But the work that they've done and the data they've collected indicates there are 11 levers that sit underneath that, which we've got in the paper. And if you start to measure those levers, the overall output is happiness or well-being for the person and therefore collectively for the organisation. And when you start to track that against financial performance, you start to get a very strong correlation in terms of return. And that I think is really interesting because it demonstrates that you are building a resilient business. If you're an investor, that's quite important.
Very much so. I mean, for a long time, the concept of looking after your staff has been prevalent. Why is this different? Why is this the next level up?
Well, it's not. It's not just about looking after your staff. Of course, you want to look after your staff. This is a lot to do with the strategy that you adopt, the culture of your organisation, the behaviour of the individuals within the organisation, both at the top level, so leading by example, but also at the management level in terms of how they operate. And one of the biggest downsides for people actually within organisations of that culture and for their feelings of not being particularly well within an organisation, fun enough, is toxic behaviour by managers. I mean, there are a lot of other sort of component parts, if you like, within those 11 levers. And again, they will vary by market, so which country or countries you're in, and also by sector. So if you're in financial services or mining or the food industry or whatever those things are that you happen to be in, or if you're a law firm, they will vary hugely and the relative importance of those levers will vary. But overall, when you roll them up into the wellbeing scores, that's where you get the really good correlation. And then you can break it down by those levers, 11 levers, and have a look and see which areas you're not performing in relative to the others, and then start to do work in those areas. But I think the really important thing to remember is that, nobody's starting with a clean sheet of paper here. And what we've tried to do is get quite practical in the paper because businesses actually need to understand, well, I thought we were doing some of this, and you're absolutely right. Of course they are. Nobody's not doing some of this stuff, but it's about understanding what you're doing, where it fits in the overall framework, having a proper framework, and also understanding where the gaps are as well. And then looking at the data to work out which bits are working and which bits aren't, and which bits are relatively more important than others in your particular markets and or in organisations. So I think it gives people more clarity about how they organise themselves, rather than saying to people, actually, you need to start again. You don't. You're doing a lot, but pull it into one strategic framework. Think of it as a business strategy, which it is. It should be about your business rather than something extra as well. I think some people kind of go, oh yeah, well, we're doing some kind of social impact stuff and it's all great and everybody goes, terrific, that's lovely. But actually, if you haven't looked after your own people first, that's kind of interesting, but it won't necessarily drive performance in your organisation. If you look after your people properly and you understand what that looks like and how you build up those feelings of well-being, what we call well-being capital, you can then deploy that in your organisation and indeed outside of your organisation to the benefit of your organisation. And your business will be much more resilient and likely, certainly from the correlation analysis we've done, more profitable, to be honest. So, and the work that Oxford are doing is really compelling on that front. I think they're due to publish it. I'm hoping October time, but we'll see. Because for me, it's a three-legged stool. This is the paper I've written with Poppy and the team and various other people, is the positioning piece. Oxford are then doing some fantastic work on all of the data and the correlation analysis and demonstrating how you do this at a sort of a measurement perspective, which is you've got to have, otherwise, it's really difficult to embed it in an organisation. And then for me, the third leg then is, so how do I do this stuff really well? And I think MindForward Alliance, our role in that, there are lots of people doing it, and I think that's great. The more, frankly, the more the merrier, because then we'll get it done. But building best practice, thinking about the difference between India and the States, or Singapore and London, or whatever it happens to be, and then building out that best practice and capability and sharing it with people, so that organisations can go, well, I tried this, it wasn't very good. They go, oh, well, yeah, well, I did it this way. Oh, really? That's interesting. And it's those conversations that actually make a massive difference, because people then learn from each other, and that's so important.
No, very much so. I mean, the statistics are staggering, aren't they? The people that are really struggling, and even in a post-pandemic world, what does this new mix, the hybrid mix, look like, and the effect and the juggle that everybody's having since the pandemic?
Yes, people. It's sort of revolutionised how we are expected to work, and it suits some people, not others. But it's that lack of certainty that suddenly has appeared, and people feel very vulnerable.
They do feel vulnerable. Yeah, our member survey from 2022, 42% of those answered, 3,000 people answered that, said they had experienced stress or anxiety in the last 12 months. So
a lot of people have, and I think what we have to remember as well is that everybody has mental health, but it's a spectrum. We're talking, and it's a spectrum from, a medical need, in other words, mentally unwell, and, not feeling great to quite unwell. And businesses do need to deal with that sort of almost medical, and it becomes medical, and that's fine. Having facilities for that is great. But for many people, it's, and certainly for businesses, it's trying to keep their people well, actually. And how do you build that resilience? How do you make sure people do feel well, enjoy their working, enjoy their colleagues that they work with, and feel safe, trusted, and excited about coming to work or doing their work from home, and really enjoying what they're doing. And that's where you get those kind of enhanced wellbeing scores. And guess what? When that happens, they're more innovative, they stay for longer, they encourage other good people to join, you get a good reputation in the market, and your performance improves as an organisation.
Performance is obviously key for business leaders out there. The shift from personal responsibility to more corporate responsibility for the wellbeing of staff, and there's a very unequal impact as well, isn't there, because of the pandemic? Why do you think that was?
I think that's a really interesting question. I personally think, and certainly the feedback I've had from other leaders and my own experience as leading an organisation at the time on an exco, was that you were effectively sitting in other people's living rooms or kitchens or wherever, and it was very clear whether people were coping or not in that environment. And I think people suddenly realised that actually, do you know what, when you arrive at the office door, the shop door, the factory door, whatever it happens to be, you don't leave your personal life behind, you bring it with you. But equally, you spend a lot of time at work or doing work, and therefore that has a big impact. And I think it was very visible to leaders on those Zoom calls, Teams calls, whatever they were. And we still have them, which is helpful, actually. They're good. It's good to have a combination. But it was very visible when people weren't managing. Sometimes they turned their cameras off. Sometimes they were sort of disengaged, and those kinds of things. And in fact, we did some training on how to spot people who weren't coping on those Zoom calls, because obviously we weren't seeing them face to face. And I think that the level of performance as well was initially took a dip, and then some people coped less well. And again, because it was a different type of performance and you weren't in the office to oversee people, you had to sort of change habits quite quickly and what have you. And I think that whole kind of disruption around what normal work looks like, I think just threw that right down on the table and went, actually, as a business, you have to take responsibility for this, because if your people aren't coping, guess what? They're not going to produce great stuff and your business is going to suffer. On the other piece, which is why some people in different cultures were affected more, and I think particularly in certainly in the States and in the UK, Northern Europe, those kinds of places, and lots of other markets as well. But in the UK and the States in particular, the Black and ethnic minority community, particularly in the UK, but the Asian community, Black and Asian community, in the States it would have been the Hispanic and Black community predominantly. A lot of those people were in frontline roles. So they weren't at home. They were actually out and about doing stuff. And therefore they were more susceptible to catching the disease because they were meeting people, they were doing things, physical activity and what have you. They were doctors, they were nurses, they were working in hospitals, they were, out cleaning. I mean, they were doing a lot of stuff that meant they couldn't do it at home.
Key worker roles.
Key worker roles. They were really important key worker roles. And therefore they were more exposed to the virus. I think that didn't help. I also, there's good evidence to suggest that those people who came from more disadvantaged backgrounds also were, the virus affected them because they weren't as well themselves beforehand. Perhaps they had underlying health conditions. They tended to live in multi-generational households, for example, where, the kids might get it and give it to granny or grandpa or whatever it happened to be. So a whole lot of kind of sort of dynamics and stuff like that that actually meant that those households were unfortunately more vulnerable. And so they were impacted more than some of the other households. It was really, it was quite salutary, actually.
So tell me, why should professionals read your report? And this is the first of a series, so what can we expect next?
I'll take the second bit first. It is part of a series, but I'm not going to be producing the series. So for me, as I say, there's this sort of three-legged stool of a positioning paper, the data, which Oxford University are doing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and then the work that we will be doing, along with many others, to help businesses and indeed individuals, but businesses in particular, because that's our focus at MindForward Alliance, to help their employees and colleagues stay well and build resilience. So that's likely to be where more stuff is coming, so the how-to, best practice, research on, how do you, we're doing some research on stigma, for example, and there are various other sort of aspects of that we'll be doing work with. We've also doing some work with the McKinsey Health Institute as well, to looking at some of those aspects. But the work that Oxford University are doing, they have also co-founded the World Wellbeing movement, which a lot of quite large businesses have joined, and they're going to be looking at how you measure this. As I say, they've done a huge amount of research on it, and I just think that that for me is the next. It's a jigsaw puzzle. That for me is the next part of the jigsaw puzzle, because once you are able to do the correlation analysis, which they have done between that and performance, and I'll tell you one of the things they have done, which is quite interesting, then you have to take it seriously, because it is absolutely fundamental to the performance of your business. This building of well-being capital, which then enables the business to be resilient, enables the business to perform and therefore do better. What they've done, which is really interesting, they've taken the data that they've got. I mean, they're doing a huge amount of work on it, but one of the things they've done, they've compiled what they've called a well-being index. So 100 companies who have scored well on the wellbeing index that they have got, with these 11 levers sitting underneath it. And then they've taken that as sort of what I call 0, and they've plotted their financial performance and their share price against the various global indices. And they track the same shape, but all of those on their global 100 list are tracking above the key indices. And then they did that for the first year, and then they re-zeroed it, changed the index because some people fell out and some people came in. So they kept the top 100, and there was a bit of change, a bit like the FTSE or any other indices, which is interesting. And they've started tracking it again, and the same thing's happening. And I think that's really interesting.
So it really is a business imperative.
Yeah, it really is a business imperative. And I think once that data and the analysis starts to get out into the market, I think they're going to be a lot of folk who kind of go, oh, right, okay, I get it. We're going to have to do something about this. I sort of intuitively knew that we probably did, but I didn't have the evidence. I've now got the evidence. Now I can actually do this. And a number of chairs I spoke to whilst I was pulling this paper together kind of went, I kind of know I need to, but I need to be able to measure it, and I can't at the moment. And so this, for me, that piece of the jigsaw puzzle is absolutely critical. And then what do I do about it? Which again, as I say, the McKinsey Health Institute, ourselves at MindForward Alliance, and lots of other folk who are doing great work, can then start to help with what works and actually what doesn't work as well, but what works. And that'll vary by market and company, as I said.
Henrietta, this has been so interesting. Thank you so much for your time today and to explore the report. We'll make the report available for CISI members.
That would be great. And we'd welcome feedback. If people have got great thoughts and ideas on it, or things that they've done that have worked, we'd love to hear about them, because, that's how collectively, this isn't, any one person doing something. This has to be a collective effort for businesses to do that. I mean, the vast majority of people are in work. If businesses can get this right, that then goes out into the communities and affects families, and all of those kinds of things. And one of the best reports we have ourselves is actually how parents help teenagers with their mental health issues, and that is, it's one of our biggest sort of downloaded reports, and those parents are in work in these kinds of businesses. And so making those kinds of assets available globally is going to be really important, to really step change this, both in terms of organisations' performance, which is the critical part, but really importantly, that people can talk about it openly. That they don't mind having a conversation about how they're feeling. And that businesses have got really, really good understanding of their workforce, of their culture, and the sorts of initiatives they need to put in place to ensure that they are very resilient and that people really enjoy working there and they're feeling well about it. And I just think that's where we need to get to, and I'm pretty excited about that.
Thank you, Henrietta.